The desert wind carried nothing but dust and despair across the barren landscape of Arizona Territory. 1873. Red earth stretched endlessly toward jagged mountains that clawed at the cloudless sky like the fingers of buried giants. The San Pedro River, once a lifeline for travelers and settlers, had dwindled to a mere trickle, leaving behind cracked mud and the bones of cattle that hadn't survived the drought. Margaret Sullivan stood at the edge of Copper Creek, watching the last of her belongings burn in a pile behind the general store. The townspeople had made their decision clear. She was no longer welcome. At 24, she had become a widow under circumstances that whispered of scandal and misfortune. Her husband Thomas had been found dead in their small adobe home 3 weeks prior, his body bearing marks that the town doctor couldn't explain. Some said it was poison, others whispered of a curse. But Margaret knew the truth. Thomas had drunk himself to death, leaving behind debts to every merchant in town and a wife whose reputation was now forever tainted. "Witch," spat Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, as she passed by with her daughters. "First you bring that no-good gambler to our Christian town, and now look what's happened. Death follows you like a shadow." Margaret pulled her faded blue shawl tighter around her shoulders. Though the morning sun was already beginning its merciless climb, she had no words left to defend herself. The past weeks had stripped her of everything: her home, seized for Thomas's debts, her dignity, torn away by wagging tongues, and now even her few remaining possessions, burned on the orders of Mayor Whitlock, who claimed they carried bad luck. The market square was beginning to fill with vendors and early shoppers. Margaret knew she needed to leave, but where could a woman alone go in this unforgiving land? She had no family back east. They had disowned her when she'd run off with Thomas 5 years ago. No friends remained who would risk their own standing to help her. As she turned to walk toward the edge of town, a rough hand grabbed her arm. She found herself staring into the leering face of Jake Morrison, a drifter who'd arrived in Copper Creek just days before. Well, he drawled, his breath reeking of whiskey despite the early hour. "The widow Sullivan, I hear you're looking for a way out of town." "Let go of me," Margaret said quietly, trying to pull away. His grip tightened. "Now, don't be unfriendly. I know some men down in Mexico way who'd pay good money for a pretty thing like you. Lonely miners need company, if you understand my meaning." Fear shot through Margaret like lightning. She'd heard tales of women who disappeared, sold to brothels in lawless border towns. With a desperate surge of strength, she wrenched her arm free and struck Morrison across the face with her small canvas bag, the only possession she'd managed to save from the fire. "You'll regret that," he snarled, lunging for her. Margaret ran. Her worn boots slapped against the packed dirt of Main Street as shouts erupted behind her. She darted between buildings, past the church where no one would offer her sanctuary, past the school where children were taught to fear women like her. The edge of town approached rapidly, and beyond it lay only the vast, unforgiving desert. But she didn't stop. Better to die under the sun than suffer the fate Morrison had planned for her. The town fell away behind her as she plunged into the wilderness. Saguaro cacti stood like silent sentinels, their arms raised in mock surrender to the blazing sky. Creosote bushes released their sharp scent into the air, and loose rocks shifted treacherously under her feet. Her dress, already threadbare, caught on thorny ocotillo branches, tearing further with each stumbling step. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, transforming the landscape into a shimmering hell. Margaret's throat burned with thirst, her lips cracking in the dry air. She had no water, no food, no shelter. In her panic, she hadn't thought beyond escape. Now, as the morning gave way to brutal afternoon, the reality of her situation became clear. The desert would kill her just as surely as Jake Morrison would have destroyed her. She stumbled into a shallow wash, where the ghost of water had carved a winding path through the rocks. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed in the meager shade of a Palo Verde tree. Vultures circled overhead, patient as death itself. As consciousness flickered in and out, Margaret heard something that made her heart freeze. the sound of hoofbeats. Morrison had followed her. She tried to stand, to run again, but her body wouldn't obey. She could only lie there, waiting for the inevitable. But the rider who appeared at the rim of the wash wasn't Jake Morrison. Silhouetted against the burning sky sat a figure on a painted horse. Long black hair fell past broad shoulders, and the rifle across his lap caught the sunlight. An Apache warrior, his face painted with red ochre, regarded her with eyes as dark and unreadable as the desert night. Margaret had heard the stories, raids on settlements, stolen livestock, murdered prospectors. The Apache were the terror of the territory, fighting desperately to hold on to their ancestral lands as white settlers pushed ever westward. To encounter one alone meant certain death, yet, as she lay there, too exhausted to feel proper fear, she noticed something in his expression that didn't match the savage tales. He dismounted with fluid grace, approaching slowly, his moccasins silent on the rocky ground. When he knelt beside her, she saw that his eyes held not cruelty, but a wariness mixed with something she couldn't name. He produced a water gourd from his horse and held it to her lips. The water was warm, but clean, and Margaret drank greedily, survival instinct overcoming fear. When she'd had enough, he sat back on his heels, studying her torn dress, her sunburned skin, the desperation written across her features. The Apache said something in his own language, the words flowing like water over stones. Margaret shook her head, not understanding. He pointed back toward Copper Creek, then made a gesture she recognized. A question. Why was she here? How could she explain? How could she make him understand that civilization had cast her out, that she was running from a fate worse than death? She simply shook her head again and pointed to the vast desert ahead. Then to herself. She had nowhere else to go. The warrior stood, seeming to come to a decision. He whistled softly, and his horse approached. With surprising gentleness, he helped Margaret to her feet. She swayed, still weak, and he steadied her with one strong hand. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, Margaret Sullivan found herself facing a choice she'd never imagined. Behind her lay the world that had rejected her, a world of cruel whispers, burning possessions, and men who saw her as commodity. Before her stood an Apache warrior, offering nothing but water and an unspoken question. The desert wind picked up, carrying the scent of coming night. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and its cry seemed to echo the loneliness in her own heart. Margaret looked into the warrior's dark eyes one more time, seeing there a reflection of her own loss, her own defiance against a world that would grind them both to dust. She took a step forward, away from Copper Creek, and toward the unknown. The Apache nodded once, as if he'd expected nothing less. As darkness began to fall across the hostile landscape, two unlikely souls prepared to navigate the treacherous path ahead, bound by nothing more than a shared understanding that sometimes the only choice is to keep moving forward, no matter where the trail might lead. The Apache warrior kept his distance as they traveled through the cooling desert, always staying several paces ahead on his painted horse. Margaret followed on foot, her legs trembling with each step, but she refused to show weakness. Pride was all she had left, and she clung to it like a lifeline. As darkness deepened, he finally stopped near a cluster of large boulders that formed a natural shelter. Without a word, he dismounted and began gathering dried mesquite branches. Margaret watched, uncertain, as he built a small fire with practiced efficiency. The flames cast dancing shadows on the rock walls, creating a circle of warmth in the cold desert night. He disappeared briefly into the darkness, returning with his horse's saddlebags. From them, he produced a piece of dried meat and a handful of piñon nuts. He placed half on a flat stone and pushed it toward her, then retreated to the opposite side of the fire. Margaret's stomach cramped with hunger, but she hesitated. Everything she'd been taught warned her against trusting an Apache. Yet what choice did she have? She was already beyond the reach of civilization's protection, if it had ever protected her at all. She ate slowly, aware of his watchful gaze. The meat was tough and salty, the nuts bitter. but to her starved body. It was a feast. When she finished, she looked up to find him studying her with those dark, unreadable eyes. "Thank you," she said softly, knowing he wouldn't understand the words, but hoping the tone would convey her meaning. He nodded once, then spoke again in Apache. His voice was deep and measured, lacking the harsh guttural sounds she'd expected from the stories. He pointed to himself and said a word. Dakota. His name. Margaret understood and pointed to herself. Margaret. Margaret, he repeated, the syllables foreign on his tongue. Then he gestured to her torn feet, visible through her ruined boots. Margaret looked down, seeing for the first time how badly she'd damaged them in her flight. Blood had seeped through the leather, and blisters had formed and burst. The pain, held at bay by fear and adrenaline, now made itself known. Dakota rose and went to his horse again, returning with a small leather pouch. He sat closer this time, though still maintaining a respectful distance, and gestured for her to remove her boots. Margaret hesitated. To be bootless in the desert was to be vulnerable, but infection would kill her just as surely as exposure. Slowly, wincing, she pulled off the ruined footwear. Dakota's expression didn't change as he examined the damage, but she saw a flicker of something, sympathy, understanding. In his eyes, he opened the pouch and began applying a paste that smelled of sage and something else she couldn't identify. His touch was surprisingly gentle for hands that had known violence. The paste stung at first, then brought blessed coolness. As he worked, Margaret studied him in the firelight. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30 winters, with the lean strength of a man who lived by skill and endurance. Scars marked his arms and chest, each one a story of survival in this harsh land. When he finished, he produced strips of soft buckskin and wrapped her feet with the same careful attention. The intimacy of the act, a strange man tending her wounds, should have frightened her. Instead, she felt an odd sense of safety, the first she'd known in weeks. Dakota returned to his side of the fire and spoke again, this time accompanying his words with gestures. He pointed to the ground, then made a sleeping motion. Rest. Then he pointed to the stars moving across the sky, swept his arm to indicate the sun's path, and held up 2 fingers. 2 days' travel. To where? Margaret wondered, but didn't know how to ask. Did it matter? She had nowhere else to go, as if reading her thoughts. Dakota sketched in the dirt with a stick, mountains, a winding path, and what might have been a stream, a destination, though what awaited there, she couldn't guess. The fire burned lower, and exhaustion pulled at Margaret like a physical weight. She curled up on the hard ground, using her torn shawl as a pitiful pillow. Sleep seemed impossible in this alien place, with danger all around and a warrior she didn't know watching over her. But Dakota made no move toward her. He sat with his back against a boulder, rifle across his lap, eyes scanning the darkness beyond their small circle of light. A protector, not a threat. Margaret dozed fitfully, waking often to check that he was still there. Each time, she found him alert, watching. Once, when a distant howl made her start, he spoke softly in his language. The tone was reassuring, almost gentle. Dawn came slowly, painting the desert in soft purples and pinks. Margaret woke to find Dakota already up, the fire cold ashes. He handed her more water and a piece of flatbread she hadn't seen him prepare. As she ate, he saddled his horse and then surprised her by gesturing for her to mount. Margaret had ridden before. Thomas had insisted on teaching her, one of the few kind things he'd done, but never bareback on an Indian pony. Dakota helped her up, his hands strong and steady at her waist. He adjusted her position, showing her how to grip with her knees, then took the horse's lead rope and began walking. They traveled this way through the morning, Dakota on foot despite the horse being his. Margaret wanted to protest the arrangement, but her feet throbbed even through the buckskin wrappings, and she knew she couldn't have walked far. The landscape changed as they climbed higher into the foothills. Saguaros gave way to juniper and scrub oak. The air grew cooler, and Margaret glimpsed actual water, a small stream running through a narrow canyon. Dakota stopped there to let the horse drink. He showed Margaret how to cup water in her hands and drink upstream from the animal, then demonstrated finding water in the pulp of a barrel cactus, carefully avoiding the spines. As the day wore on, he taught her other things through gesture and demonstration: which plants held moisture, which insects meant water was near, how to read the sky for coming storms. He was patient when she didn't understand, repeating the lessons without frustration. By evening, they'd reached a sheltered spot high in the canyon. Ancient petroglyphs marked the rock walls, spirals and figures that spoke of those who'd passed this way countless generations before. As Dakota built another fire, Margaret found herself wondering about him. Why had he helped her? What had he seen in her desperate flight that moved him to kindness instead of violence? She tried to ask, using gestures and the few Apache words she'd picked up. He seemed to understand, for his expression grew distant, touched with a sadness that made him suddenly, achingly human. He spoke slowly, using signs to help her understand. Soldiers, fire, women and children. His hands painted a picture of loss that needed no translation. He too knew what it was to have everything taken, to be left with nothing but the will to survive. Margaret felt tears sting her eyes, the first she'd allowed herself since Thomas's death. Not for her husband, who'd brought her nothing but shame, but for the understanding she saw in this stranger's face. They were both refugees, both outcasts from worlds that had no place for them. That night, as she lay by the fire, Margaret felt something shift inside her. The fear was still there, along with uncertainty about what tomorrow would bring. But beneath it grew a fragile hope. When Dakota spoke softly in the darkness, words she couldn't understand but whose tone conveyed reassurance, she found herself responding. "I'll try," she whispered. "I'll try to be strong enough for whatever comes next." The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and indifferent to human suffering. But here, in this small circle of firelight, two damaged souls had found an unexpected connection. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a beginning. As sleep finally claimed her, Margaret heard Dakota moving about, checking the perimeter of their camp, maintaining his vigilant watch. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt protected. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears, but tonight she was not alone. And in the harsh mathematics of survival, that made all the difference. The third night brought rain, sudden and violent as all desert storms are. Margaret huddled beneath an overhang of rock, watching Dakota work quickly to protect their meager supplies. He moved with the efficiency of someone who'd weathered many such storms, and she found herself remembering another man who'd once claimed to protect her. Thomas Sullivan had swept into her life like a dust devil, all charm and promises. She'd been 19, working in her father's dry goods store in Kansas City, dreaming of adventure beyond the endless prairie. Thomas had painted pictures of fortune in the West, of gold strikes and cattle empires waiting to be built. "Come with me, Maggie," he'd whispered against her neck at the summer dance. "I'll make you a queen out there." Her parents had forbidden it. Thomas was a gambler, they said, a man who lived by his wits and his winning smile. But Margaret had seen only possibility, only escape from a future of measuring flour and cutting calico until she grew old behind a counter. She'd left a note and slipped away in the night, meeting Thomas at the stage depot with only a carpet bag and her mother's silver hairbrush, the disappointment in her father's eyes when he'd discovered her gone. She'd imagined it 1,000 times since. The early days had held a kind of desperate sweetness. Thomas was tender when he won at cards, bringing her ribbons and small luxuries. But the wins grew fewer as they moved from town to town, always one step ahead of angry creditors. The tenderness curdled into something else, accusations that she brought him bad luck, that her presence at his elbow made the cards turn against him. By the time they reached Copper Creek, Thomas was drinking heavily. The man who'd promised her a kingdom could barely keep a roof over their heads. Margaret took in washing, mended clothes, did whatever honest work she could find. But in a town where respectability meant everything, the wife of a known gambler found few open doors. The night Thomas died, He'd come home meaner than usual, stinking of cheap whiskey and cheaper perfume. He'd lost again. Lost big to men who wouldn't accept promises as payment. "It's your fault," he'd slurred, advancing on her with fists clenched. "You've cursed me. Woman, ever since I took you from your daddy's store, you've been nothing but a millstone around my neck." Margaret had backed away, but there was nowhere to go in their tiny adobe. When he grabbed for her, she'd pushed him, not hard, just enough to get free. But Thomas, drunk as he was, had stumbled backward. His head had struck the corner of their heavy wooden table with a sound she still heard in her nightmares. He'd lain there, blood pooling beneath his skull, while Margaret stood frozen. By the time she'd gathered her wits enough to fetch the doctor, Thomas was gone, and with him went any chance she had of being accepted in Copper Creek. Thunder crashed overhead, bringing Margaret back to the present. Dakota had finished securing their camp and now sat across from her, water streaming from his long hair. In the flashes of lightning, she could see him watching her with those dark, knowing eyes. He spoke softly in Apache, and though she didn't understand the words, she heard the question in them. Without knowing why, she found herself telling him, using gestures, broken phrases, and the universal language of grief. She showed him how Thomas had fallen, mimed the drinking, the gambling, the slow poison of a love that had turned to resentment. Dakota listened without judgment, occasionally nodding as if her story held echoes of tales he'd heard before. When she finished, tears mixed with rainwater on her cheeks. She waited for him to show disgust, to turn away from her as everyone else had. Instead, he moved closer, still maintaining that careful distance, but near enough that she could see his face clearly. Now it was his turn to share. His hands painted pictures in the air as he spoke. A village by a river, women grinding corn, children playing, men returning from a hunt. Peace. Then his expression darkened. Soldiers came at dawn, blue coats with brass buttons that caught the rising sun. The people were told they must move, leave their ancestral lands for a reservation far to the east. When the elders protested, when the young men stood firm, the soldiers opened fire. Dakota's voice broke as he gestured. His wife, heavy with child, his small daughter, barely walking, his mother, his sisters, all gone in smoke and screams. He'd been away, scouting for game in the high country. He'd returned to ashes and corpses. The few survivors had fled to the mountains, but soldiers pursued them relentlessly, one by one. His people scattered or died. Now he rode alone, the last of his band, carrying the weight of the dead on his shoulders. Margaret reached out instinctively, her hand stopping just short of his. She understood now why he'd helped her. In her desperate flight, he'd seen an echo of his own loss, his own exile from everything that had given life meaning. "I'm sorry," she whispered, knowing the words were inadequate in any language. Dakota looked at her hand, so close to his, then slowly covered it with his own. His palm was calloused but warm, and Margaret felt something electric pass between them. Not desire, not yet, but recognition. They were both walking ghosts, haunted by different tragedies but united in their displacement. The storm began to ease, thunder grumbling away across the mountains. Dakota released her hand and moved back to his usual spot. But something fundamental had changed. The careful distance between them had become a bridge. He reached into his pack and pulled out something wrapped in buckskin. Unfolding it revealed a small wooden flute, intricately carved with symbols Margaret couldn't read. Dakota held it to his lips and began to play. The melody was unlike anything she'd heard before, neither the jaunty fiddle tunes of barn dances nor the hymns of Sunday service. It spoke of wind through canyon walls, of eagles circling an endless sky, of love and loss and the turning of seasons. Margaret closed her eyes and let the music wash over her, feeling for the first time in months something loosening in her chest. When the song ended, silence settled over them like a blanket. The rain had stopped completely, leaving the air clean and sharp with the scent of wet sage. Dakota carefully rewrapped the flute and put it away. Then he did something that surprised her. He smiled. It was a small thing, just a slight lifting of the corners of his mouth. but it transformed his face. For a moment, she glimpsed the man he might have been before tragedy carved those lines around his eyes. Margaret found herself smiling back, and it felt foreign on her face. When had she last smiled with genuine warmth instead of fearful appeasement? They settled for sleep as they had each night before, on opposite sides of the dying fire. But the space between them no longer felt like a chasm. It was simply distance, and distance could be crossed. As Margaret drifted towards sleep, she thought about the strange turns that had brought her here. A week ago, she'd been the town pariah, branded with scandal and marked for a terrible fate. Now she lay under stars in the company of an Apache warrior who'd shown her more kindness than any civilized man had in years. She thought of the soldiers who'd destroyed Dakota's world, of the townspeople who'd burned her possessions. Was there really so much difference between them? Both claimed righteousness. Both dealt in cruelty masked as justice. "Dakota," she said softly into the darkness. "Margaret," he responded, letting her know he was still awake, still watching. She wanted to say more, to tell him she understood, that she saw his grief and honored it, that his presence made her feel human again. But she had no words in his language, and her own seemed insufficient. Instead, she spoke the only truth that mattered. "Thank you." She heard him shift, perhaps nodding in the darkness. Then he spoke in Apache, a long, soft stream of words. She didn't understand them, but she heard in his tone what might have been a promise, a reassurance, or perhaps a recognition of their shared humanity. Tomorrow they would continue their journey to whatever destination he had in mind. Margaret didn't know what awaited them there, whether safety or simply a different kind of danger. But tonight, in this moment, she was content to exist in the space between what was lost and what might yet be found. The stars emerged from behind the last trailing clouds, brilliant in the rain-washed sky. Margaret fell asleep to the sound of Dakota's quiet breathing and the distant call of an owl, feeling for the first time in memory that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The fourth day dawned hot and still, the air already shimmering with heat mirages by the time they broke camp. Margaret had grown accustomed to their routine, Dakota rising before dawn to scout the area, returning with water and whatever edible plants he could find, then helping her onto his horse for another day's journey deeper into the mountains. But this morning felt different. Dakota's movements held attention she hadn't seen before, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. When he helped her mount, his hands lingered on her waist, and he spoke urgently in Apache, pointing back the way they'd come. Margaret followed his gesture and saw them, tiny specks of dust rising in the distance, too regular to be wind-driven. Riders? Her heart clenched with the familiar grip of fear. Dakota vaulted up behind her on the horse, the first time they'd ridden together. His arms came around her to take the reins, and Margaret was acutely aware of his solid presence at her back. He urged the horse into a ground-eating lope, taking a path that wound between towering red rocks and through narrow defiles. They rode hard through the morning, stopping only to rest the horse in whatever shade they could find. Each time, Dakota would climb to a high point and study their back trail, his expression growing grimmer. The dust clouds were closer now, resolving into individual riders, at least 6, maybe more. At midday, they reached a wide canyon where the trail split in 3 directions. Dakota dismounted and quickly began obscuring their tracks, using a branch of sage to sweep away hoofprints. He led the horse into the leftmost trail, then doubled back on foot, creating false trails down the other 2 paths. When he returned, sweat beading his brow, he lifted Margaret down from the horse. His hands were gentle but urgent as he guided her to a hidden cleft in the rocks, barely wide enough for them to squeeze through. Beyond was a small cave, cool and dark. Dakota led the horse inside. Margaret was amazed it fit, and began preparing for what she realized would be a fight. He checked his rifle, counted his ammunition, and loosened his knife in its sheath. Then he turned to her. From his pack, he produced a small revolver, pressing it into her hands. Margaret had never held a gun before, and the weight of it frightened her. Dakota showed her how to cock the hammer, how to aim, how to squeeze rather than pull the trigger. His hands covered hers, steady and reassuring, as he guided her through the motions. Then he positioned her deeper in the cave, behind a natural wall of stone that would provide cover. He spoke earnestly in Apache, and though she didn't understand the words, his meaning was clear. Stay hidden. Use the gun only if they get past me. Don't come out no matter what you hear. Margaret grabbed his arm as he turned to go. Dakota, no, we can keep running. We can... He silenced her with a finger to her lips, then cupped her face in his hands. For a long moment, they looked at each other, and Margaret saw in his eyes not the cold warrior of legend, but a man prepared to die for someone he barely knew. Someone who, by all the rules of their separate worlds, should be his enemy. He pressed his forehead to hers briefly, a gesture that felt like both blessing and farewell. Then he was gone, melting into the shadows at the cave mouth with his rifle. Margaret huddled behind her stone shelter, the revolver heavy in her trembling hands. The silence stretched out, broken only by the nervous stamping of Dakota's horse and her own thundering heartbeat. Then came the voices, rough and Anglo, echoing off the canyon walls. Tracks lead this way. Jake. Margaret's blood turned to ice. Jake Morrison. He'd found her. That Apache buck can't have gone far with her. Morrison's voice replied, Spread out, boys. Check every hole and crevice. There's good money in bringing her back, and I aim to collect. What about the Indian? Another voice asked. Kill him, Morrison said flatly. One less savage in the world. But the woman comes back alive. She's worth nothing to the houses in Juarez if she's damaged too much. Margaret bit her knuckle to stifle a sob. The fate she'd fled was closing in, brought by men who saw her as nothing more than goods to be sold. A rifle shot cracked through the air, followed by a scream. Not Dakota's voice, one of Morrison's men. Chaos erupted outside. More shots, men shouting. The sound of running feet on stone. Margaret pressed herself against the cave wall, trying to track the battle by sound. Dakota's rifle spoke with measured precision, each shot followed by cries of pain or anger. But Morrison had brought many men, and they were closing in. She heard Morrison roar, There, behind those rocks! Flank him! You idiots! More gunfire. So much that it became a continuous thunder. Then, suddenly, silence. Got him! Someone shouted triumphantly. The Red Devil's down! Margaret's heart stopped. No, not Dakota. Not the man who'd shown her kindness when the world offered only cruelty. Find the woman, Morrison commanded. She's got to be nearby. Check that cave. Footsteps approached, accompanied by harsh breathing. Margaret raised the revolver with shaking hands. Remembering Dakota's instructions, cock the hammer. Aim for center mass. Squeeze. Don't pull. A figure appeared in the cave mouth, silhouetted against the bright afternoon. Morrison's leering face split into a grin as his eyes adjusted to the darkness. Well, Mrs. Sullivan, you've led us quite a chase. He stepped closer, confident. Now put down that gun before you hurt yourself, darling. You're coming with me whether you like it or... Margaret fired. The revolver bucked in her hands, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Morrison staggered back, looking down in shock at the spreading red stain on his shirt. You shot me, he gasped, disbelief in his voice. Margaret cocked the hammer again, her hands steadier now. Get out! Morrison stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder. She'd hit him high, not a killing shot. He made it to the cave entrance before collapsing, cursing viciously. The woman's got a gun, he shouted to his remaining men. Get her! Rush her! But no rush came. Instead, Margaret heard sounds of renewed fighting outside, the clash of bodies, grunts of effort, a cry cut short. Then, blessed silence. She waited, hardly daring to breathe, the revolver growing heavy in her grip, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. A shadow fell across the cave entrance again. Margaret, Dakota's voice, hoarse but alive. Margaret let out a sob of relief, nearly dropping the gun. He appeared in the entrance, bloodied but standing. A graze marked his temple, and his left arm hung awkwardly. But he was alive. He took in the scene, Morrison groaning on the ground, Margaret with the smoking revolver, and something like pride flickered across his face. He stepped over Morrison without a glance and came to her, gently taking the gun from her numb fingers. "It's over," he said in heavily accented English, the first English words she'd heard him speak. "You, safe now." Margaret threw herself against him, not caring about propriety or the blood on his shirt. He winced, but wrapped his good arm around her, holding her as she shook with delayed reaction. Outside, she could see the aftermath of the battle. 3 men lay still in the dust. 2 others, including Morrison, were wounded but alive, their weapons scattered far from reach. The last man had apparently fled, his dust trail visible in the distance. Dakota released her reluctantly and went to secure the survivors. He bound their wounds with rough efficiency, enough to keep them from dying, but nothing gentle about it. Morrison glared at them both with naked hatred. "You think this is over?" he spat. "There'll be others. The whole territory will know she ran off with a savage. They'll hunt you both down like dogs." Dakota ignored him, but Margaret knelt beside the wounded man. "Tell them she's dead," she said quietly. "Tell them you found my body in the desert, picked clean by vultures. Tell them whatever you want, but Margaret Sullivan died out here. There's no one left to hunt." Morrison's eyes narrowed, calculating even through his pain. "And what's in it for me to spread such a tale?" Margaret looked up at Dakota, who nodded slightly. She understood. "Your life," she said simply. "Tell them I'm dead, and you ride away from here. Keep coming after us, and—" She glanced meaningfully at Dakota's rifle. It wasn't much of a choice. Morrison nodded sullenly. They left the wounded men with water and their horses, after Dakota removed all weapons and ammunition. As they rode away on Dakota's paint horse, Margaret didn't look back. That part of her life was truly over now, ended not in flight but in violence and blood. But she'd fought for her freedom. She'd stood her ground when it mattered most. And the man who'd taught her to be strong still lived, wounded but unbroken, as they climbed higher into the mountains, leaving the battlefield behind. Margaret felt something fundamental shift inside her. She was no longer running from something. Now, perhaps, she was running toward something, though what that might be, she couldn't yet say. The sun was setting as Dakota finally stopped in a sheltered grove of piñon pines. He nearly fell from the horse, his strength finally failing. Margaret caught him, supporting his weight as best she could, and helped him to a soft patch of ground. Now it was her turn to care for him, as he had cared for her, and as she began cleaning his wounds with gentle hands. Margaret realized that somewhere in the last 4 days, this strange, silent warrior had become essential to her very breath. "Stay," she whispered in the gathering darkness, echoing words she didn't yet know he would soon speak to her. "Stay with me." Word of Margaret Sullivan's supposed death spread through the territory like wildfire. Jake Morrison, nursing his wounded shoulder and pride, had spun a tale of finding her remains in a ravine. Identifying her only by the torn remnants of her blue dress, the good people of Copper Creek expressed appropriate shock and murmured about the wages of sin. But privately, many were relieved. The scandal had died with her. Order was restored. Meanwhile, high in the Chiricahua Mountains, Margaret learned to live as the Apache did. Dakota's wound healed slowly, and during those weeks of recovery, he taught her the skills of survival that his people had perfected over generations. She learned to move silently through the forest, to read the signs of water in the flight patterns of birds, to identify which roots could be eaten and which would bring death. But the outside world would not leave them in peace. Rumors began to circulate in the settlements below, glimpses of a white woman with an Apache brave, stealing supplies from isolated homesteads, living like savages in the wild places. The stories grew with each telling, until Margaret became a figure of dark fascination, the woman who had chosen red over white, savage over civilized. It was a full moon night when they first heard the hunting party, dogs baying in the distance, the crack of branches under many feet. Dakota had found them shelter in a deep cave system he'd known since boyhood, but even these secret places were no longer safe. "They come," he said in his improved English, watching the torches flickering far below their position. Many men, looking for you. Margaret pressed herself against the cold stone wall, fighting despair. For us, she corrected. They're looking for us both. The distinction mattered. She was no longer the frightened woman who had fled Copper Creek. The past months had hardened her, teaching her strength she'd never known she possessed. But they had also shown her something else, the depth of feeling that had grown between her and this quiet warrior. It had started with small things, the way he smiled when she successfully snared her first rabbit, how his eyes followed her movements around their camp, the careful way he braided feathers into her hair, marking her as under his protection according to Apache custom. Then came the night when fever from his old wound had returned, leaving him delirious and shaking. Margaret had held him through the darkness, cooling his burning skin with wet cloths, whispering prayers in English while he muttered in Apache. When the fever broke at dawn, he'd looked at her with such naked gratitude that it took her breath away. Margaret, he'd whispered, reaching up to touch her face. My heart sees you. She'd understood then what she'd been trying to deny, that somewhere between that first drink of water in the desert and this moment, she had fallen completely, irrevocably in love with him. But love between them meant choosing exile forever. It meant never walking into a town without fear, never sleeping without one ear listening for danger. It meant accepting that the world would always see their union as an abomination. Now, with the hunters closing in, Margaret faced that choice starkly. Dakota was preparing their few possessions, ready to flee deeper into the wilderness. But she could see the weariness in his movements, the way constant vigilance had worn lines around his eyes. Wait, she said, putting a hand on his arm. What if we didn't run this time? He looked at her, not understanding. Margaret took a deep breath. What if I went down there, told them I'd been held captive, that I escaped, they'd take me back to civilization, and you'd be free to— No! The word came out sharp as a rifle crack. Dakota gripped her shoulders, his dark eyes fierce. You think I let you go? You think I watched them take you back to that world? He struggled with the English words for what he wanted to say. Margaret, you are my sunrise, my water in desert. Without you, I am walking ghost again. Tears stung her eyes. But this life, always running, always hiding. You could find another Apache woman, rebuild— He silenced her with a kiss. Their first— It was desperate and tender at once, tasting of smoke and wild honey, of all the words they couldn't say in each other's languages but understood in their souls. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Dakota rested his forehead against hers. Stay, he said, the English word careful on his tongue. Stay, and I'll never let you go. The phrase hung between them like a promise, like a chain, like freedom itself. Margaret closed her eyes, seeing two paths stretching before her. One led back to the world she'd known, where she might eventually rebuild some semblance of a respectable life. The other led into the unknown with this man, this love that defied every boundary her world had taught her to respect. The baying of dogs grew closer. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll stay. They moved swiftly then, gathering their few possessions. But Dakota surprised her by leading the horse not away from the hunters, but parallel to them, along a treacherous path that skirted the canyon rim. Trust, he said when she looked at him questioningly. They traveled in tense silence, the sounds of pursuit sometimes near, sometimes fading. Just before dawn, they reached what Dakota had been seeking, a narrow bridge of stone spanning a deep gorge, barely wide enough for a horse to cross. On the other side lay Mexico. Margaret understood. Once they crossed, they would be beyond the reach of U.S. and law, beyond the hunters and the judgment of Copper Creek, but they would also be truly outside everything, belonging nowhere, accepted by neither world. Dakota crossed first, leading the horse with practiced ease, despite the dizzying drop below. Then he turned back, extending his hand to her. Margaret stood at the edge of everything she'd ever known. Behind her, she could hear the hunters crashing through the brush, following their trail. Their dogs would find this place soon. She looked at Dakota's outstretched hand, at his face illuminated by the first rays of dawn. In his eyes, she saw not just love but partnership, not just passion but respect. He wasn't asking her to become Apache or demanding she remain white. He was simply asking her to be herself. With him, consequences be damned. Margaret took his hand and stepped onto the bridge. The crossing seemed to last forever, each step a choice renewed. Wind tugged at her clothes, and far below, a river glinted like silver thread. But Dakota's grip was sure, his presence steady. And then she was across, standing on foreign soil with her old life burning behind her like a funeral pyre. They heard the hunters reach the bridge, heard their curses and frustrated shouts. But none would risk the crossing. Not for a supposedly dead woman and one Apache warrior. Let Mexico have them. As they rode south into the rising sun, Margaret felt something lift from her shoulders, the weight of others' expectations, perhaps, or the burden of trying to fit into a world that had no place for her. She was no longer the widow Sullivan, no longer the scandal of Copper Creek. She was simply Margaret, choosing love over safety, partnership over propriety. Dakota began to sing softly as they rode, an Apache traveling song about journeys that end only to begin again. Margaret didn't understand the words, but she hummed along, adding her voice to his. They didn't know what lay ahead. There would be hardships. Certainly, prejudice and danger would follow them even into Mexico, but there would also be moments of joy, of peace, of two hearts learning to beat as one despite all the forces trying to tear them apart. The bridge was far behind them now, and with it, the last chance to turn back. Margaret didn't look over her shoulder. Instead, she leaned back against Dakota's chest, feeling his heartbeat strong and steady against her spine. "No regrets?" he asked softly in her ear, his English careful but clear. "No regrets," she confirmed, meaning it with every fiber of her being. Somewhere ahead lay a new life, built on their own terms. It wouldn't be easy. It might not even be long, but it would be theirs, and that was worth any price the world demanded. The sun climbed higher, painting the desert in shades of gold and red, and two souls, bound by choice rather than law, rode toward whatever destiny awaited them, together. The cave mouth yawned before them like a gateway to the underworld, hidden behind a waterfall in the Sierra Madre Mountains. They'd been riding for 3 days since crossing into Mexico, and exhaustion weighed on them both like a physical burden. But they'd finally found it, the sanctuary Dakota had spoken of, where remnants of his people had taken refuge. As they approached, Apache scouts materialized from the rocks like ghosts, rifles trained on them. Margaret's heart hammered as harsh words flew between Dakota and the guards. She caught her name several times. Margaret, spoken with suspicion and hostility. An older warrior with gray-streaked hair stepped forward, his face a map of scars and hard years. He and Dakota engaged in a tense exchange, gestures growing heated. The man pointed at Margaret repeatedly, his meaning clear without translation. "Why have you brought this white woman here?" Finally, Dakota dismounted and helped Margaret down, keeping her close to his side. He spoke at length, his tone shifting from defensive to pleading. She heard him mention the soldiers, saw him gesture to indicate fire and death. The gathered Apache listened in stony silence. When he finished, the older man, who Margaret would later learn was named Kuruk, a war chief who'd survived countless battles, studied her with eyes like chips of obsidian. He asked her something directly in Apache. "He wants to know." Dakota translated quietly. "If you come as white woman looking for Apache servant, or as woman who stands beside warrior as equal." Margaret understood this was a test, perhaps the most important of her life. She stepped forward, away from Dakota's protective presence, and met Kuruk's hard gaze. "I come as Margaret," she said clearly. "Not white, not Apache. Just a woman who loves this man and will face whatever comes because of it." Dakota translated her words. A murmur ran through the assembled warriors. Some looked skeptical, others hostile. But a few, particularly the women who had begun to gather at the edges of the group, watched her with something that might have been understanding, Karuk spoke again, and this time Takota's translation was reluctant. He says you must prove yourself, that any woman who stands with Apache must be strong enough to survive as Apache. How? Margaret asked, though she dreaded the answer. The test, as it turned out, was brutal in its simplicity. She would spend 3 days and nights alone in the wilderness with only a knife and the clothes on her back. If she survived and found her way back, she would be accepted. If not, Takota argued fiercely against it. But Karuk was immovable. This was the way. Their people had lost too much to trust easily, especially a white woman who might bring soldiers to their door. That night, their last together before the trial, Takota held her close in the shelter they'd been grudgingly given at the edge of camp. "You don't have to do this," he whispered against her hair. "We can leave. Find somewhere else." "No." Margaret pulled back to look at him. "These are your people. What's left of them? You need this place, this connection, and I won't be the reason you lose it." "I already lost them once," he said roughly. "I won't lose you too." She kissed him softly. "You won't. I'm stronger than I look. Remember? You taught me well." But when dawn came and she was led to the trial grounds, Margaret felt anything but strong. The knife felt foreign in her hand, and the vast wilderness stretching before her seemed hostile and impossible. Takota wasn't allowed to say goodbye properly, but as she passed him, he pressed something into her hand, a small piece of turquoise wrapped in sinew. "For strength," he murmured. "And so spirits know you are protected." Then she was alone. The first day was the hardest. Without Takota's guidance, every sound became a threat, every shadow a potential danger. She found water by following game trails as he'd taught her, and managed to dig up some edible roots. But when night fell and the temperature plummeted, she had no fire, no shelter beyond a shallow depression she'd scraped in the earth. She clutched the turquoise and thought of Takota, of the life they could have if she just survived this. The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had witnessed her flight from Copper Creek. How far she'd come from the woman who had collapsed in the desert, waiting for death. The second day brought new challenges. A rattlesnake forced her to detour from the water source she'd found. Hunger gnawed at her constantly. But she remembered Takota showing her how to set snares, and by evening she'd caught a small rabbit. Raw meat revolted her, but she forced it down, knowing she needed the strength. That night, she managed to start a fire using the friction method Takota had demonstrated so patiently. The small flame felt like a massive victory, and she fed it carefully through the cold hours, dozing fitfully with her back against a boulder. On the third day, she realized she was lost. The landmarks she'd tried to memorize were confused in her exhausted mind. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but she forced herself to stop, to think. What would Takota do? She climbed to higher ground, studying the landscape. There, a distinctive peak that looked like a hawk's head. She'd seen it from the camp, using it as a guide. She began making her way back, moving slowly but steadily. It was near sunset when she stumbled into the Apache camp, filthy, exhausted, but alive. The gathered people watched silently as she made her way to where Karuk sat. She placed the knife at his feet and stood straight despite her trembling legs. "I survived," she said simply. Karuk's weathered face remained impassive, but she caught something in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or grudging respect. He spoke, and this time an Apache woman translated, her accent thick but understandable. "He says you have passed the test of body, but there is test of spirit also." Margaret wanted to weep. What more could they ask of her? But she nodded, jaw set. "I'm ready." The test of spirit, it turned out, was both simpler and more profound than surviving in the wilderness. She was brought before the gathered community and asked to tell her story, all of it, why she was here, what she had lost, what she hoped to find. With Takota translating, Margaret spoke of Thomas and his failures, of the town that had cast her out, of fleeing into the desert expecting death. She told of Takota's kindness, of learning to see the world through different eyes, of choosing love over the safety of her own kind. I know what it is to lose everything, she said, looking at the faces around the fire. Old women who'd seen their children killed. Young warriors who'd never know the freedom their fathers had. Children who would grow up in hiding. I know what it is to be hated for who you are, not what you've done. I can't become Apache. But I can stand with you, fight beside you, mourn with you, if you'll have me. When she finished, silence stretched long. Then an old woman stood, moving forward with difficulty. She reached out and touched Margaret's face with gnarled fingers, speaking softly. My grandmother says, the translator explained, that she sees truth in your eyes, that loss makes family of strangers. If hearts are open, one by one, others began to speak. Not all were welcoming. Some remained suspicious, even hostile. But enough spoke for her that when Karuk finally stood, Margaret dared to hope. You are not Apache, he said through the translator. You will never be Apache, but you are woman of Dakota, and Dakota is our brother. As long as you bring no harm to our people, you may stay. Relief buckled Margaret's knees. Dakota was there instantly, catching her, holding her up. The gathered Apache began to disperse. The judgment given. That night, there was a small ceremony. Not a wedding in any sense Margaret understood, but an acknowledgement. She and Dakota stood before the community as partners, their hands bound together with a strip of deerskin, while an elder spoke words Margaret couldn't understand but felt in her bones. Later, in their own shelter, properly theirs now. Not a grudging loan. Dakota traced the scratches and bruises from her trial with gentle fingers. You should not have had to prove yourself, he said softly. You already proved everything when you chose to stay. They needed to know I was strong enough. Margaret replied, that I wouldn't be a burden or bring danger to them. You were never burden, he said fiercely. You are my strength. She kissed him then, pouring all her love and relief into the connection. When they came together that night, it was as equals, as partners who had both sacrificed and suffered to reach this moment. The joining of their bodies was a seal on the promise they'd made, to face whatever came, together, outside. She could hear the sounds of the camp settling for the night, children being hushed to sleep, guards taking their positions, the eternal whisper of wind through mountain peaks. It wasn't the life she'd imagined as a young woman in Kansas City, but it was real and honest, and hers. No more running, she asked against Dakota's shoulder. No more running, he confirmed. This is home now. We make our stand here. Margaret thought of the bitter irony that she'd found acceptance among the Apache that she'd never known in civilization, that she'd discovered strength in herself only after losing everything else, that love had bloomed in the most unlikely ground. Between two people the world said should be enemies. But perhaps that was the greatest truth of all, that love recognized no boundaries, acknowledged no forbidden territories. It simply was, like water finding its way through stone, like flowers blooming in the desert after rain. As sleep claimed her, Margaret felt the turquoise talisman warm against her skin where it hung on a cord around her neck. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the constant work of survival in a hostile world. But tonight, she was home. Life in the Apache camp settled into rhythms as old as the mountains themselves. Margaret woke each dawn to the sound of women preparing the morning meal, the scrape of stone on corn, the crackle of carefully tended fires. She learned their ways not through formal teaching but through watchful observation and gradual acceptance. The woman who had first translated for her, named Ayana, became her primary guide. Ayana had lost her husband to soldiers 2 winters past and understood what it meant to rebuild a life from ashes. She taught Margaret to weave baskets so tightly they could hold water, to identify plants that could heal wounds or ease childbirth, to preserve meat in the old ways that would keep it edible through the harsh mountain winters. But acceptance came slowly, measured in small gestures. The first time a child ran to Margaret when it fell and scraped its knee. The morning an elder woman wordlessly handed her a grinding stone, including her in the communal work. The evening when warriors returning from a hunt nodded to her in acknowledgement rather than suspicion. It was during the autumn moon when everything changed again. A Mexican patrol had been spotted near their hidden valley, too close for comfort. The camp was preparing to move deeper into the mountains when young Nayeli went missing. The 6-year-old daughter of one of the warriors had wandered off while gathering piñon nuts with the other children. Search parties were organized quickly, but the approaching soldiers meant they couldn't spread out too far or risk discovery. As night fell with no sign of the child, her mother's quiet keening tore at Margaret's heart. "I know these hills now," Margaret told Dakota. "Let me search the western slopes. I can move quietly, and the soldiers won't shoot a white woman on sight if I'm discovered." Dakota's face was stone. "Too dangerous. If soldiers find you with Apache, they will not care you are white. And if we don't find her before they reach this area, she'll die alone and afraid," Margaret countered. "Please, I can do this." It was Kuruk who made the decision. Overriding Dakota's protests, time was precious, and Margaret did have advantages the Apache didn't. She set out with the moon high overhead, carrying only water and moving through terrain she'd come to know intimately during her months in camp. She found Nayeli near dawn, huddled in a crevice where she'd hidden after twisting her ankle. The child was terrified, cold, but alive. Margaret gathered her close, wrapping her in her own shawl, whispering soothing words in a mixture of English and the Apache phrases she'd learned. But as they made their way back, voices reached them, Spanish, harsh with military command. The patrol was directly in their path. Margaret's mind raced. She couldn't outrun them carrying an injured child, but perhaps... She quickly adjusted her appearance, pulling her hair loose in the style of Mexican women, dirtying her face strategically. When the soldiers appeared through the trees, she was ready with a story. "Ayuda!" she cried in the Spanish she'd picked up in border towns. "Please help! My daughter! She's hurt!" The soldiers approached cautiously, rifles ready. Margaret babbled a tale of being a miner's widow, lost while traveling to relatives in Sonora. She kept Nayeli's face pressed to her shoulder, hidden by the shawl and her loose hair. The sergeant, a man with kind eyes and gray temples, lowered his weapon. "Senora, these mountains are dangerous. There are Apache nearby." "I know," Margaret said, letting real fear color her voice. "I've been so frightened. Please, which way to the nearest settlement?" He gave her directions, even offered to escort her, but Margaret declined, claiming her fictional relatives were expecting her. As the patrol moved on, she heard one soldier mutter about foolish women traveling alone, but they suspected nothing. Margaret waited until they were long gone before circling back toward camp, Nayeli clinging to her neck. The child whispered something in Apache, and though Margaret didn't understand all the words, she caught the meaning. "You saved me." Their return to camp was met with joy and relief. Nayeli's mother embraced Margaret with tears streaming down her face, speaking rapid Apache that needed no translation. But it was Kuruk's reaction that marked the true shift. The war chief approached her formally. In front of the entire camp, "You risked yourself for one of our children," he said through Ayana. "You used wit and courage when strength would have failed. This is Apache way to protect the young, to think beyond the self." He placed a hand on her shoulder, the gesture heavy with significance. "You are not Apache by blood, but you have Apache heart." From that day forward, Margaret's place in the community was secured. She learned their songs, added her voice to the morning chants for the lost, celebrated when babies were born healthy and strong. She became especially skilled at dealing with Mexican traders who occasionally came to their hidden camps, her white face and fluent English providing cover for gathering supplies and information. One evening, as the first snows dusted the peaks, Dakota taught her a new phrase in Apache. When she repeated it, asking what it meant, he smiled. "It means, she who bridges two worlds," he said. "It is what the elders call you now, your name among us." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. A name, an identity beyond widow or outcast or white woman, a recognition of who she'd become. But even as she found her place, danger pressed ever closer. The Mexican government was cracking down on Apache refugees, pressed by the Americans to control the Indian problem. Soldiers came more frequently, forcing the band to move their camp repeatedly. It was during one such relocation that disaster nearly struck. They were crossing a narrow mountain pass when soldiers appeared on the ridge above, having tracked them through the snow. Gunfire erupted, echoing off the canyon walls. "Into the caves," Kuruk shouted, directing people toward a series of caverns in the cliff face. But the elderly and children were moving too slowly. Margaret saw old grandmother Dahlia struggling with two young ones whose mother had been separated in the chaos. Without thinking, Margaret rushed back, scooping up the youngest child while supporting Dahlia with her free arm. Bullets sparked off the rocks around them. She heard Dakota's voice calling her name in anguish, but she kept moving, half dragging, half carrying her charges toward safety. They almost made it. The cave mouth was just ahead when Margaret felt the punch of impact in her side, spinning her around. She managed to push Dahlia and the children into cover before falling, her vision graying at the edges. Strong arms caught her. Dakota, his face a mask of terror as he dragged her into the cave. She could hear shooting, screaming, the chaos of battle, but it all seemed very far away. What felt immediate was the warm wetness spreading across her side. Dakota's hands pressing desperately against the wound. "Stay with me," he commanded in Apache, then English, then Apache again, as if trying every language to make her obey. "Margaret, stay." She wanted to tell him it was all right, that she'd made her choice long ago on that stone bridge, that every moment since had been a gift she'd never expected. But words were too hard, so she just held his eyes with hers, trying to pour all her love through that connection. The medicine woman, Ciala, pushed Dakota aside with sharp words, her ancient hands surprisingly steady as she worked. Margaret drifted in and out of consciousness, aware of chanting, of bitter herbs forced between her lips, of Dakota's voice rising in what sounded like threats or prayers or both. She dreamed of Kansas City, of her parents' disappointed faces, of Thomas, young and charming before whiskey took hold, of the desert where she'd expected to die but found life instead, of Dakota's eyes the first time she'd seen him, wary but kind, offering water to a stranger. When she finally woke properly, weak but lucid, the first thing she saw was Dakota asleep beside her, his hand wrapped around hers as if he could anchor her to life through touch alone. His face was haggard, aged by worry, and she realized he'd been keeping vigil for days. "Water," she croaked, and his eyes flew open. The joy that transformed his features was almost painful to witness. He helped her drink, his hands trembling, then pressed his forehead to hers, whispering prayers of gratitude in Apache. Later, she learned the battle had been won, the soldiers driven off, but at cost. 3 warriors dead, several wounded, and the band forced to flee even deeper into the inhospitable mountains. As she recovered, members of the tribe came to visit, bringing small gifts. A perfectly round stone from a child, a beautifully woven hair tie from Ayana, healing herbs from Ciala. Even Kuruk came, sitting beside her in silence for a long moment before speaking. "You have spilled blood for us," he said simply. "This makes you family in ways ceremony cannot. When you are well, there is something I would teach you." What he taught her, once she could walk again, was the Apache way of war. Not to make her a warrior. That wasn't their way for women, but to make her a defender. She learned to shoot Dakota's rifle with deadly accuracy, to move through terrain like smoke, to think tactically about defense and escape. The world will always try to destroy us. Kuruk explained through Ayana one evening as Margaret practiced. We must be ready, all of us. Margaret understood. She'd crossed from one world to another, but the crossing had changed her fundamentally. She was no longer just seeking sanctuary among the Apache. She was one of them in all the ways that mattered, bound by choice and blood and sacrifice. That night, as she lay beside Dakota in their shelter, she traced the new scar on her side. It would always mark her, a reminder of the moment she'd proven beyond doubt where her loyalties lay. "Do you regret?" Dakota asked softly. His English still careful, but so much improved. This life, always fighting, always hiding. Margaret turned to face him fully, seeing in his eyes the same love that had sustained her through everything. "The only thing I regret," she said firmly, "is that it took me so long to find you." He kissed her then, and in that kiss was promise and passion and the peculiar peace that comes from knowing you are exactly where you belong, no matter how difficult the path that brought you there. Outside, snow began to fall, covering their tracks, hiding them once more from those who would destroy what they'd built. But inside, warmed by fire and love and the bonds of chosen family, Margaret had never felt safer or more truly home. The dawn came wrapped in gun smoke and thunder. Mexican soldiers had found their winter camp, approaching under cover of a blizzard that had muffled their movements until it was too late. Margaret woke to Dakota shaking her urgently, his face grim in the dim light. "They come from 3 sides," he said tersely. "Many soldiers. We must go." Outside, chaos reigned. Women grabbed children and what supplies they could carry. Warriors took positions among the rocks, buying time for the others to escape. The elderly and wounded were being helped onto the few horses they had. Margaret didn't hesitate. She grabbed her rifle and the medicine bundle Ciala had taught her to prepare, then rushed to help Ayana with the children. Little Nayeli clung to her hand, eyes wide with fear but trusting. "Stay close to me," Margaret told her in Apache, proud that she could offer comfort in the child's own language. The escape route led through a narrow canyon that opened into a maze of paths. Karuk had drilled them on this: scatter if pursued, meet at the predetermined gathering point. But as they entered the canyon, disaster struck. A second force of soldiers appeared at the far end, cutting off their escape. "Back!" Dakota shouted, but behind them, the main force was advancing. They were trapped. Karuk made a swift decision. The warriors would hold both ends while the women and children climbed the canyon walls. It was desperate. The climb was treacherous, especially with snow and ice, but it was their only chance. "Go!" Dakota urged Margaret, pressing ammunition into her hands. "Protect them. Not without you," she said fiercely. His eyes blazed. "You must. For them. For—" He touched her belly gently, and Margaret understood. The new life growing there. Still secret. Still fragile. Their future. "Stay, and I'll never let you go," she reminded him, echoing his old promise. "And I keep that promise by making sure you live," he replied, kissing her hard before turning back to the fight. Margaret climbed, helping push children up to narrow ledges, steadying elders across icy patches. Below, the battle raged. She could hear Dakota's rifle, distinctive in its rhythm, and prayed to every spirit she'd learned to honor that it wouldn't fall silent. Halfway up, young Toddy slipped, his mother's scream piercing the air as he slid toward the edge. Margaret lunged, catching his wrist just as he went over. For a heart-stopping moment, they both dangled, her grip on the rock the only thing keeping them from falling. "Hold on," she gasped in Apache, her muscles screaming. Other hands reached down, Ayana and another woman, pulling them both to safety. Toddy's mother wept with relief, clutching her son. But there was no time to rest. They had to keep climbing. They were near the top when Margaret heard it. Dakota's war cry, followed by silence where his rifle had been. Her heart shattered, but she forced herself to keep moving, to keep helping others. That's what he would want. At the canyon rim, they scattered as planned. Margaret led her group through paths she'd learned during hunting expeditions, using every skill Dakota had taught her about moving unseen. Behind them, the sounds of battle grew distant, then ceased altogether. For 2 days, they moved through the frozen wilderness, Margaret using her white appearance to scout ahead, checking for patrols. When they finally reached the gathering point, a hidden valley with caves for shelter, only half the band had arrived. Karuk was there, wounded but alive. Several warriors had made it, but so many were missing, including Dakota. Margaret wanted to collapse, to scream her grief to the uncaring sky. But Nayeli still held her hand, and other children looked to her for reassurance. So she did what the Apache women had taught her. She endured, channeling her anguish into action, tending wounds, organizing shelters, maintaining hope for those who had none left. On the third night, as she sat watch at the valley entrance, she heard movement in the darkness. Her rifle came up smoothly. Kuruk's training automatic now. "Margaret." The voice was weak, but unmistakable. Dakota stumbled into view, supported by 2 other warriors, all 3 bloodied and exhausted, but alive. Margaret's composure finally shattered. She flew to him, her hands checking for serious wounds even as tears streamed down her face. His left arm was useless, likely broken, and a gash marked his temple, but he was alive, gloriously alive. "Told you," he murmured against her hair. "Never let you go." The reunion was bittersweet. They had survived, but at terrible cost. 12 members of their band were gone, including old grandmother Dahlia, who'd refused to slow others down. The Mexican army was systematically eliminating Apache refugees, supported by American pressure and modern weapons. That night, as Ciala tended Dakota's wounds, Kuruk called a council. The discussion was long and painful, but the conclusion inevitable. They couldn't continue like this, always running, losing people with each encounter. They needed to find a more permanent solution. "There is a place," one of the older warriors said, "far south, beyond the desert, where the government leaves indigenous peoples alone, where we might live in peace. It would mean leaving everything familiar, traveling hundreds of miles through hostile territory. It would mean truly leaving the Apache homeland behind. But what choice did they have?" Margaret listened as they debated, her hand resting on her still flat belly. She thought of the child growing there, Dakota's child, who deserved a chance at life without constant fear. When Kuruk asked her opinion, a mark of how fully she'd been accepted, she spoke from her heart. "Home isn't a place," she said in Apache, her accent still noticeable but her words clear. "Home is where your people are, where you can raise children in safety, where love can grow without fear. If that place is south, then south we go." The decision was made. They would rest, heal, gather supplies, then make the journey. It would be dangerous, perhaps impossible, but it was hope, and hope was all they had left. That night, Margaret told Dakota about the baby. His joy was radiant even through his pain, and he held her as if she were made of precious crystal. "A child of 2 worlds," he whispered, "born to bridge what others say cannot be bridged." "Like us," Margaret agreed, pressing close to his warmth. They made love gently, mindful of injuries but needing the connection, the affirmation of life in the face of so much death. Afterward, they lay entwined, planning a future that seemed impossible but was theirs to attempt. "Are you afraid?" Dakota asked. "Terrified," Margaret admitted. "But I've been terrified since the day I fled Copper Creek. Fear and I are old companions now. It doesn't control me anymore." He kissed her forehead. "My brave one, my heart." As dawn approached, bringing with it all the challenges of another day of survival, Margaret reflected on the strange path that had brought her here, from a failed marriage in a hostile town to a new family forged in adversity, from a woman who'd never held a gun to one who could defend those she loved, from someone who'd thought her life over to someone carrying new life within her. The journey south would be long and dangerous. They might not all survive it, but whatever came, she would face it as she'd learned to face everything, with courage, with determination, and with the unbreakable bonds of love that had transformed her from Margaret Sullivan, scandal of Copper Creek, into she who bridges 2 worlds, daughter of the Apache by choice and sacrifice. Dakota stirred beside her, murmuring her name in his sleep. She soothed him with gentle touches, humming an Apache lullaby she'd learned for the children. Soon, she would sing it to their own child, born of love that had defied every boundary their world tried to impose. The sun rose over the mountains, painting the snow crimson and gold. A new day, bringing new challenges but also new possibilities. Margaret rose to meet it, no longer running from her past but walking toward her future. whatever it might hold. In the end, that's all any of them could do. Keep moving forward, keep protecting each other, keep believing that somewhere beyond the horizon lay a place where love like theirs could exist without apology or fear. The Apache had a saying, "Walk in beauty." Margaret finally understood what it meant. Not physical beauty, but the beauty of living with purpose, with honor, with love that transcended all boundaries. She would walk that path for as long as breath remained in her body, beside the man who'd shown her the way, among the people who'd become her own. The Wild West was changing, the old ways dying beneath the march of progress, but in hidden valleys and secret places, love still bloomed like desert flowers after rain. And sometimes, just sometimes, that was enough to sustain hope for a better tomorrow. As the camp stirred to life around her, Margaret took up her rifle and her purpose, ready to face whatever came next. She was no longer nobody's woman, no longer running with nowhere to go. She was exactly where she belonged, with the only people who mattered, living a love story that the world said couldn't exist, but that beat strong and true with every breath they drew together. The end of one journey, the beginning of another, and love, always love, lighting the way forward through the darkness. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I'd love to know where in the world you're enjoying this tale. Please share in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel for more authentic frontier stories. And let me know your thoughts on Margaret and Dakota's journey. What touched your heart? What surprised you? Your feedback helps me craft stories that resonate with listeners everywhere. Until our next adventure in the Old West, partners.